but you don't have to start right this minute. You can just do.
I mean, you don't have to go live exactly at 6.
Well, but it's too late.
Oh, okay then.
But you can just do Paul Miller stuff until you're ready
Paul
to
Miller stuff.
start. And camera angle looks good.
All right. Well, whenever you get the mic and everyone else gets in here, unless Eli has the mic.
Oh, the mic is.
So yeah, for everyone, we're going to be in Jude 1 verse 6 today. So when I get opened up to that place, that's where we're going to be.
I think it might be best for you to go micless, because when I did like my latest First Corinthians site and we went live on that, and I was using this, the mic didn't work. So
Well, if I go live without the mic, no one's going to hear me.
no, it can still pick up audio.
Picking me up off of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Gonna have to get that figured out soon.
Okay. Not an issue. Eli, apparently that mic is all kerfuffled right now and you got to pick me up just off of the webcam mic. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. It'll work.
All right.
Fantastic.
He's got it.
Have the mic. You can just start. It's fine. We won't use it today.
Okay. No, I just want to make sure that actually did pick me up. So, is anyone else coming in, or?
It's just this one out there and someone else.
Okay, I'll give him like a minute. We can go from there. Yeah, I think it would be a good idea if we can get the actual camera hooked up to this at some point.
Yeah.
If for no other reason, then we can do the dual screen thing.
Yeah. And didn't you say you also wanted like your?
It definitely works.
Okay, cool. All right, we'll just do it this way then. All right, technology weirdness aside, let's get started. So we're doing Jude 1, verse 6. This is a famous, or in some cases infamous, verse in the Bible, and there are entire libraries written on it from all kinds of different viewpoints. We're going to go through some of those. We'll also tell you kind of what I believe is the correct answer, why I happen to hold that opinion. And then we're going to sort of go through and analyze it and figure out why it's here in Jude. And most importantly, what does it actually mean for us? What does it actually teach us? How do we apply it in the current year to our lives and the problems that we have? So that's sort of our basic outline. Before we do that, does anyone want to pray us in? Camden.
Dear Jesus, thank you for this day. Thank you for all you've given us. Pray we'll have the wisdom and knowledge to be able to understand this, pick this apart, how we can take away from these angels that left their abode, how we can apply that in the church, individually, corporately. Amen.
Amen. All right, so let's just start by reading the verse and then we'll take it from there. So verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Okay, so obviously, main point up front, we're going to go through some background on this, as well as some various differing views. Then we're going to go through the objections that a lot of people have to the view that we're going through. I will give you some additional reading if you're more interested in kind of getting into this on your own. As I said, literal volumes have been written on this topic, and I'm not going to do it all justice today. Then we're going to actually talk about these angels. We're going to talk about their past state, their present state, and their future state, what it actually means in Jude. Why did Jude feel like dropping this really weird, curveball out of the middle of nowhere, for this? Why is it actually here? And then how do we apply it to ourselves? Okay, so main point, and in keeping with what Jude has been talking about and kind of the theme of this first half of Jude, is God does in fact judge. He judges everyone regardless of their station or their standing. In this case, he is using the example of angels. You'll recall last week he was using the example of Israel and their wilderness wanderings to say, hey, he's judging them. Now he's talking about angels and their judgment. If the angels are accountable to God, then guess what? We are also accountable to God, because angels are, obviously bigger, higher, more powerful than us. If they didn't escape judgment, how do we think we were going to escape any sort of judgment? For our purposes, the church needs to repent, cleanse itself, and follow after God. There's a lot of sin in the church. There's a lot of problems in the church. There's a lot of, bickering, fighting, infighting, etc. That doesn't please God in any way. And if God judged them, guess what? He's going to judge us as well. Now, yes, in terms of, our salvation, our justification, that's, not really what I'm talking about there. But we do lose rewards for the way that we act, the way we behave. I think it also makes us much less effective when we are like that, because people can very rightly point at the church and say, well, look at how you guys are acting. Why would I believe anything that you're saying? It's been a very valid criticism of the church since, its beginning in a lot of cases. All right, so let's go through the background of different views. There's basically three kind of main views for how we're going to look at and interpret this. The first view is basically, hey, Jude doesn't really tell us what this is, and we don't have anywhere that it's, specifically points out where this is. Therefore, God doesn't really want us to know exactly what that means. That's a common view that some people will put forth. I disagree with this because it seems to go against Romans 12, verse 4, where God says, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. If you put it in here, he expects us to know it because he put it here for a reason. It doesn't make sense to, go give a piece of information and say, haha, you're never going to figure it out. The one strange counterexample you might have to that is at the end of the book of Daniel, where the angel tells Daniel to seal up the prophecy for it's, kind of hidden till the time of the end. I'll point out that God doesn't do that here. Therefore, I'd argue he does in fact expect us to figure it out and understand it. The second view is that these are the angels that rebelled with Satan. That's a common way of looking at it, maybe the most common way of looking at it. However, there are some problems. People will support this idea by pointing out Revelation 12, verses 1 through 6, where it shows Satan and a third of the angels basically being cast out of heaven. And they'll say, well, clearly these are those angels. The problem with that is that right now Satan and his angels are not bound. These angels are bound. Therefore, they cannot be the same ones. They cannot be in the same category as those angels. So whatever these are, it had to have happened from either a separate event or a separate grouping of those angels. We can also infer that this is a different event that takes place clearly after the fall of Satan, but also probably after Genesis chapter 3. Again, those angels were bound. These angels are bound. The ones that fell with Satan are not. We can infer, obviously, since Satan was walking around and his angels are part of that same sort of category, that his other angels would have been doing something as well. Therefore, whatever this is, it is a different event, most likely after that. This leads to the third and easily the most controversial view of this, which is what's known as the B'nai Elohim, which is the Hebrew for the sons of God. You will read about them in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, if you want to turn there. I'm going to tell you right now, this is the view that we're going to take. That being said, Acts 17:11, don't believe what I tell you. Search the scriptures and find out if what I'm saying is true or not. If we go to Genesis chapter 6, starting verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years, i.e., I'm going to destroy the world at that point. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. Those were the mighty men of old, the men of renown." Whenever we see this term in the Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, used, it is used to refer to angels. It's used 3 times in Job. God was sitting there in heaven, and the sons of God came for him to, do all this sort of stuff. It's B'nai Elohim. That is the exact same Hebrew word that is used here when it says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, etc., etc. It's the same group of people. Therefore, from the Hebrew, we can infer that whatever these angels are, that's kind of what he's talking about. And yeah, it is exactly kind of what you think that says. Now, your translation probably has giants in there. There were giants in those days. That's kind of an unfortunate translation. We get the word giant here from the Greek translation of this. The Greek word is gigantus. When we think of giants, we think of, big giant NBA player kind of people. These people were probably large like that, but that's not really what the word means. The word actually means earthborn or something akin to that. The more accurate term is the one you'll find in the Hebrew, which is the word Nephilim, which means the fallen ones, which is a really weird term that you're going to be throwing out. The inference that people make, and that I tend to follow along with, is that there was some category of angels. They looked down at what God made, said, wow, those girls are really hot. Let's go have sex with them. And then they did, and there was some weird product that resulted from that. It's a really weird, it is a really creepy view, it is a really controversial view, but from the text alone, I have to say that that's probably what that says. That being said, there are a lot of objections to this view, and I'd like to go through some of them. Not necessarily to support this one in toto, but simply to show that out of all available hypotheses, this is probably the best one. The first objection is that it's just weird and spooky. Yes, it is weird and spooky. That's not really an argument. That's simply an emotional reaction. There's a lot of weird stuff in the Bible, but that's what it says. I'm not going to try and defend it. And yep, it is weird. The most common one that you will come across, however, is that this is not the, quote, historical view, i.e. this is not what the church has historically taught. Historical church teaching around Genesis chapter 6 has been known as the line of Seth view. In other words, that the sons of God were from the line of Seth. These were, the good people. This is traditionally presented as these were the good Christians going to church, doing good Christian kind of things. And then they saw these evil, wicked daughters, and they just took them astray, et cetera, and it'll go into some kind of, application of, why Christians shouldn't marry, unsafe people or whatever. That's great, but that actually isn't the historical church view, at least not the original one. If you go into the very earliest of both the Jewish and the Hebrew commentators, I put up a list there, you'll find that they do interpret this as the sons of God being angels. The idea of a sort of Sethite line didn't really come into play until kind of the 4th century with someone, a Roman emperor known as Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate basically tried to roll back a lot of what was going on in the church and get rid of it. You've got a question, I see.
I just need the spelling of that, but
It's up on the,
he mentioned.
Right there. View 3, B apostrophe Nai
N. Okay, got it.
Elohim. Yeah,
Thank you. Sorry.
no worries. Anyway, Julian Apostate, he tried to roll back, a lot of what was going on with the church and kind of bringing it back to the Roman Empire back to its more pagan roots. And one of the attacks that he leveled against the church is, ha ha ha, look how stupid and crazy you are. You think angels are coming down and having sex with people. Ha, look how stupid you are. And that bothered the church. I don't know why. It's literally in Greek mythology. Look at Zeus, the guy's coming down having sex with literally everything. I'm not joking about that. Read Greek mythology sometime. Anyway, it still bothered the church. So a lot of the church leaders tried to reinterpret a lot of those really uncomfortable passages to kind of get around a lot of those attacks that they were seeing. However, this argument of the line of Seth fails for a couple reasons. Number one, if you have a Christian and a non-Christian come together and they have children, their children may be monsters, but they're not fundamentally abnormal. Like, it's just, that's not how that happens. Second, this somehow relies on the idea that the line of Seth was somehow better and good. That's not really the case. First of all, if we look at the pre-flood period, there's really nothing good about it. There's not some magical other group of people. Furthermore, if you go back to Genesis chapter 4, you go to verse 25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, who Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him he was born, and he named Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Call upon the name of the Lord is really a mistranslation. A better translation, the original one that you will find in a lot of the original Hebrew translations, most notably the Targum of Jonathan, is that men began to profane the name of the Lord. They were calling against the name of the Lord. There was no magical good line of Seth out there, not that I can find. The only person really was Noah, and you can know that because Noah was the only one that got saved. Now, another very common argument against this is that angels can't do this, period, end of story. Jesus told you himself. And they'll go to Matthew 22, verse 30. Jesus is talking about sort of, resurrection bodies and, our state then. And he says, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels of God in heaven. Now, I'm going to point out, he doesn't say that they're incapable of sex. He just says that they don't get married. And I think anyone who turns on the news every now and then will realize that those are two totally different things. So, yes, this verse is often used, but it's misused in my opinion because that's not really what Jesus is talking about. Furthermore, we know that angels can do a lot of stuff. We know that they can appear in human form. We will actually talk about that next week when we go through Sodom and Gomorrah. We know that they did things like speaking to people. They ate food. They took people by the hand. They can physically interact with you. We also know they do engage in direct physical combat. We see that in 2 Kings. We also see that in Isaiah and several other places in the Bible. That is a thing that they do. Therefore, I don't find it beyond the realm of possibility that they will be able to engage in some form of bizarre sexual intercourse. I don't think that's beyond them. Next, an argument against this is that the giants that are spoken of here are just some other group of people. In other words, you've got this thing over here happening. Oh, and by the way, you also have giants. The problem is that kind of goes against the actual text itself. If you go back to verse 4, it says, there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward. If you want, you can track down what the afterword was. We're not going to do that here. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them, these were the mighty men of old, the mighty men of renown. You really have to stretch the text far to make it seem like that is a completely separate group of people that have nothing to do with that. That being said, there is sort of a what I'll call a subcategory of this view that's known as the royalty view. The idea here is that in the pre-flood time, you would have these sort of kings go about, and as a mark of their power and their station, they would marry many wives, and in these sort of polygamous relationships, that's what God is talking about here, and then those sons would grow up and be princes. they will justify this view by noting that the words "they will take wives" or whatever is very similar to the way polygamous marriages are seen later in Scripture. The problem with that is that that's also how God just describes marriage in general. If you look at Abraham, it said that he took a wife and knew her, etc., etc. Further, it's trying to basically make the pre-flood society, which we don't really know a huge amount about, and it's basically saying that is the same as what we see with the post-flood society. That may or may not be the case, but there's really no textual evidence for that, so I have a hard time drawing that conclusion. And again, it does pretty substantial violence to the text, because sure, I could say that a giant is a big, powerful king or ruler, but I can't really say that a fallen one is a giant, powerful ruler. That doesn't really fit with the text. A final argument, and it's a good argument, but it has a couple holes in it, in my opinion, is that whatever this product of salvation, or this product of these angels and women were, they apparently were never offered sort of a chance of salvation, and God brought out the animals, therefore he cares more about the animals than these people, and that doesn't seem like God. First of all, I will point out God did save the animals. He saved 2 or 7 of the clean kinds of animals, so it doesn't really make sense. I would further argue that one of the reasons God brought the judgment is that he needed a pure line of people. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, it says, from the seed of the woman, the Messiah is going to come. Well, you can't really have the seed of a woman if it's been corrupted in this manner. It's a completely different thing. I will further point out, if you go to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 16, the author of Hebrews tells us something really interesting. He says, for indeed he, that is Jesus, does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. From that, as well as a couple other passages, it kind of seems clear that Jesus didn't really die for the angels, because that's what he's talking about here. He's basically talking about Jesus coming, dying for them. This is in the context of the author of Hebrews discussing the superiority of Christ over the angels. The offer of salvation was not open to them, really. Further, we see in 2 Peter, actually we'll just go there since we're kind of already there. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, Peter, it appears, is talking about the same event. He said, for if God did not spare the angels who sinned, same kind of thing, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. You might want to underline that word hell. I don't like that translation. We're going to talk about that hell in a second. But yeah, it doesn't seem like these angels were ever offered any sort of opportunity for salvation. It was just, nope, you sinned, done. That's it. Again, that's very different from what you and I have. It's a different sort of modality that God is working in there. It is also, therefore, reasonable to conclude that whatever strange byproduct of this union was, that they also wouldn't have been eligible for that. Because again, it's not a man. That's why God came and died. In going through this, I went back to one of my systematic theology texts, this one by Norman Geisler. He essentially made the argument on page 780 and 781, if you want to track it down, that angels have a spiritual nature. In other words, they have one that is not capable of death. In other words, change, decay, etc., like you and I are. Therefore, when they sinned, when they made that deliberate choice, they were logically irredeemable, because now they have made a choice from which they can't go back, because that spiritual sense was eternal. That's essentially the argument. I will point out that he is not arguing that in the context of this passage. He's making a separate point, but I do think it fits and it follows. Therefore, based on these issues, I'm going to stick with our interpretation of the Benai Elohim. Again, it is a weird interpretation. It is a creepy interpretation. Do your own homework on it. I don't expect you to magically believe what I'm telling you. That being said, if you want to get into this, these are a couple resources for you. Number one, Fallen by Tim Chafee. That's a fairly decent resource. He's also written a lot of stuff with Answers in Genesis, if you want to track him down. Another one is called Giants, Sons of the Gods by Douglas Van Dorn. It is not quite as good in my opinion, and especially when he starts dealing with some of the post-flood things, he gets maybe a little tangential for my tastes. Another one, Angels, Messengers from the Metacosmos. This is actually a 2-volume work by Chuck Missler. It's probably one of the better, accessible, and well-rounded and researched studies on the issue of angels and demons that you're likely to find. In volume 2, he specifically addresses the issue that we're dealing with here, and he does, conclude the benign Elohim sort of hypothesis. I do want to throw one final caution out there if you start deciding you want to get into this. A lot of people and a lot of Christians, when they come across this hypothesis, will very quickly find themselves getting into the work of a man named Eric von Daniken. Eric von Daniken was a researcher, historian, archaeologist, I'm going to put a lot of those in quotes here, who wrote a series of very famous books called Chariot of the Gods, Fingerprint of the Gods, etc. You've probably heard of them. You've probably seen those books at whatever your local bookstore is. I cannot recommend his works at all. Here is the fundamental problem with him. He had a really good initial observation, but instead of simply sticking with it and letting the data speak for itself, he went completely sideways on it and ended up fabricating a lot of his own data, so you can't trust it. His initial nugget was, hey, it's kind of weird that in all of the ancient legends and cultures throughout history, there's some story that they have of giants interacting with man or these other beings coming down and helping them. Isn't that really weird? He's actually got kind of a valid point there, but the problem is, instead of just letting that stick, he made up a whole bunch of data and, quite frankly, committed academic fraud, in my opinion. So I can't really recommend his stuff unless you have an absolute morbid curiosity. It's also from him that you get the whole ancient aliens and ancient astronaut kind of thing. So if you've ever watched the History Channel, you kind of have him to thank for that, unfortunately. So I cannot recommend his works. It's just something more reputable. Okay. All of that out of the way, let's actually talk about what Jude is talking about here. So if we get back to Jude itself, let's read the passage again. Verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, some translations have first estate, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Okay. Let's talk about angels. First, what is the actual purpose and point of angels? Why did God bother to make angels? The first we learn from the Psalms is that they are just ministers of God, and they are also ministers to God, which is an interesting distinction, something you might want to look into. We also know that they are around the throne of God. Pretty much any time we get a view of the throne of God, we see it in that kind of context. A lot of people will sometimes say that they're around the throne of God to somehow protect the holiness of God or whatever. I understand the point that people are making when they say that, but it doesn't really make sense. I don't think God really needs something to protect him. I think he's perfectly capable of doing that on his own. But regardless, they are around him, and whenever we see them, they're always praising God. They're always going, guys, look how cool God is. So that's one of their jobs. Another is to do battle. We find several times in the Old Testament that they are doing battle. Yep. We further see Jesus, when he was arrested, he was sort of chastising Peter. He's like, Peter, you don't need to protect me. One word, and I can call down a legion of angels to protect me. He doesn't need that. He do battle. Another one, which is actually really interesting, is in Matthew 18, verse 10. It appears that they're there to take care of children. We may think of the idea of guardian angels as sort of a bizarre medieval sort of Catholic idea, but there is some basis in the scripture for that. I will point out, if you look at that verse, it appears that Jesus is only talking about those who either are saved or will, be justified at some point. So I think it may be more correct to say that it's not so much that they protect everyone, it's that they protect the ones who, will eventually be the inheritors of salvation. I'm not going to split hairs over that point. That's not our job here, but God does care about children. He cares about them so much that he makes sure that they have big, scary angels watching over them. Now, the word here translated as habitation, some may say abode, is the Greek word oikoterion. Now, oikoterion is a really interesting word because it only appears here and in 2 Corinthians. If you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, I'm just going to start in verse 1. Paul is talking about sort of our resurrected bodies. And in doing that, he says this: "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, i.e., my body, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven." That word habitation there, that is the same word oikoterion. Those are the only two times we see it in the scripture. It would appear that whatever state those angels inhabited, it is the same one in nature or character, what have you, that our, eternal, spiritual, heavenly bodies will have as well. This kind of makes sense if you think about it. This body that I have, it is really good for existing on Earth. It is really good for existing in 3 dimensions and doing all of the stuff that I am going to need to do. However, this body is not really good at going to heaven. It's just not. If I take a fish and I put him in outer space, he's going to be really bad in outer space because he's designed to be in the ocean. It's the same thing with our bodies. We need a completely different body in order to be where God is, for lack of a better way of putting that. Again, this is another one of those really weird passages because growing up, especially if you've been influenced by a lot of the literature that came out of the Renaissance and stuff, you'll probably run across the idea that when you die, you go up to heaven and become an angel or something like that. It is a common thing. You'll sometimes see it on little postcards or something like that that have pseudo-religious significance. That's not true. However, you can understand where those people were coming from when they saw it, because they look at verses like this and oh, it's the same thing. It's the same kind of thing, but you don't magically become an angel. An angel still is a different category of being. But again, you understand why they thought that and in a lot of cases taught that. All right, angels, their current state. It says that they are reserved in everlasting chains under darkness. So whatever these things are, this is clearly not Satan's ministers. These are not the people who are going around doing stuff. These are not the fallen angels or demons that we have to contend with out there in the world today, because they're already chained in everlasting darkness. And the problem is we got to figure out where that actually is. Unfortunately, in our vernacular, we use the word hell quite a bit. Even in the Bible, you have several different words that are translated that way, and we tend to, use those terms interchangeably. You're going to run across a lot of terms: hell, Hades, Sheol, Abraham's bosom, the abyss, hell, lake of fire, Tartarus. Those are all different things. They all mean different things. We're going to discuss them briefly so we're on the same page. If we talk about Sheol or the grave, that can either mean just death in general or sometimes your actual physical grave. You'll see in the Psalms oftentimes David will say, he went down to Sheol or something like that. The best way to think about that is with the Greek term of Hades. Hades, to both the Greek mind and the way it's used in the scriptures, it had 2 halves to it. If you think of Luke 16 with Lazarus and the rich man, this is what's going on there. One half was for the damned, the unrighteous people who, existed in torment there. You can think of the rich man looking up to, Abraham being like, send him to, dip his finger in a cool water and put it on my tongue because I'm in agony. That kind of thing. That's hell. The other half of that was what the Jews called Abraham's bosom. That's what that rich man was looking to. That was where the just went. That was where those people that were saved went. But because Jesus hadn't yet died for their sins and risen again, they couldn't go to hell. That wasn't fully paid for yet. Even think of it like this. They were saved on credit. They took their little spiritual credit card. They bought that salvation. Very poor analogy, but just stick with me. God said, yep, that's yours. It hasn't cleared the bank yet. We still have that debt on the books. So you're going to go here for a little bit until that gets taken care of. When that debt is fully paid off, then you go to heaven. We see in one of Peter's apostles that he says that, Paul's epistles, he says that Jesus descended to the bowels of the earth, and then he also ascended from there. A lot of people take that to mean that he went to one or both sides of Hades and preached these people. To the unsaved, he's saying, guys, I won. And to the saved, he's like, guess what, you're coming back with me, kind of thing. We are given to understand that Abraham's bosom is now vacated, because when Jesus was on the cross and he was talking to the righteous thief, he said, hey, today you're going to be with me in paradise. He didn't say, you're going to be with me in paradise in 3 days. You got to go down first, and then you'll come back. And he said, no, today you're going to be with me in paradise. So we get the idea that that part is now vacated, and for our purposes is not really relevant. If you die now, you either go directly to that other side of Hades, what we usually think of as hell, or you go on to live with Jesus, but you have a stop first at the judgment seat of Christ to receive all the things done in your body. We also get the abyss, in the Greek, the abuso. This is where Satan is bound for 1,000 years, basically before the end of the millennial kingdom. We also have the lake of fire, sometimes seen as Gehenna. This is that final state of man. This is where all the souls of the unsaved are thrown. This is where death itself is thrown. This is where Hades is thrown, all of it. That is the ultimate, total, final state of all things. The word used here, specifically the one that Jude uses, you remember I told you to underline the word hell, it's helpfully none of those words. It's a completely different word. Who could have thunk it? It is the word Tartaro. In our English, it's Tartarus. Unfortunately, that's the only time it appears in scriptures. How helpful. So we have to go to other uses of it in Greek. The most famous of which comes from Homer in the Iliad, which was his sort of epic poem about the Trojan War. In it, he describes Tartarus as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. Great. Digging a little further, I'm getting this from Strong's. It is described as the subterranean region, doleful and dark, regarded by the ancient Greek as the abode of the wicked dead, where they suffer punishment for their evil deeds. It can sometimes answer to the Gehenna of the Jews. That's maybe a little more debatable. Regardless, it seems that this Tartarus is, again, a separate place. We can argue back and forth. Potentially it's the abyss. Potentially it's another place. I'd say that if Peter wanted to use a different word to describe it, he would have, but he didn't. He called it Tartarus, so I'm going to assume it's a different place, whatever that happens to be. It could be that God, for whatever reason, has decided he's going to keep the human unsaved in sort of one holding cell, and the angels that sinned in a completely separate holding cell, if I could use that kind of analogy. Why he did that, I don't know, but that's kind of what it looks like he did. All right, the future state of the angels. They are reserved unto the judgment of the great day. So we know that whatever Tartarus is, it can't be the same as the lake of fire, because that's where they're ultimately going to go. That is a judgment they have not yet received. Therefore, they can't be there. You could argue that he's put them in there, and then he's going to take them out, judge them, and then put them back. That doesn't really make much sense. We don't see that happening with any other context. It's possible, but it doesn't seem likely, at least not to my mind. I will throw a spanner in that works and note that if you look at the beast and the false prophet, when they're thrown in, they're thrown directly into the lake of fire. They don't actually have to do the whole great white throne judgment. I don't know why, but sure, you can think through that one if you want. Regardless, I have to imagine that wherever they are, it's functionally a holding cell for those angels that then get sent out on that. One other point, as you're going through Revelation, you'll see a couple times, I believe it's in chapter 12, where it talks about the Euphrates being dried up, or angels coming out from the Euphrates and going and terrorizing everyone. I don't think that that's the same group of angels, because they seem like they were put there specifically to do that. Therefore, they would not have been reserved for the great day of judgment. They would have been released prior to the great day of judgment, and then put back and then pulled back out again, and then done into the great day of judgment. So again, I think that's a separate category of angels there. Their sin is eventually going to be judged. Again, going back to Hebrews, chapter 2, verses 7 and 9. Again, the author of Hebrews is making the point that Jesus is higher than the angels, and in so doing, he says this: "Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of trial in the wilderness." I'm in the wrong. I meant 2. There we go. I caught myself. All right. He says, "You have made him," that is the Messiah, Jesus, "a little lower than the angels, who have crowned him with glory and honor and set him over the works of your hands." And then going on to verse 9. "But we see Jesus, who is made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor," etc., etc. Basically, he had to become a man, which meant he had to go below the angels. So we've got the order of God, angels, man, and that kind of hierarchy. God judged these angels. It didn't matter that they were higher than us. We're not going to escape judgment either. If you're the church, in this case, in Jude's time, and you're reading this, that can be hopeful to you, because guess what? That means all of the people that are causing problems, yes, they're going to be judged. But it should also be taken as a warning for us, because God judged the angels. He's going to judge us too. We don't magically get off scot-free. No, he has justice that he has to do. Jude is one of those interesting books because you can kind of infinitely dig into it. I think it's interesting, if you ever go through the inductive Bible study, they actually have you tear apart the entire book of Job to do inductive Bible study on that. I don't know why they only give you like 3 pages in the book to do it. It usually takes way more than that. Yeah, you can pretty much infinitely dig into this. And part of the reason for that is a lot of the examples that Jude uses, like this. As interesting and fascinating as all of that is, it's important not to get unnecessarily carried away with this. What's important is that we keep the main point in view. Jude writing this wasn't writing some interesting theological treatise on the nature of angels or something like that. He was writing about God judging. We need to make sure that that remains in focus so that we don't go completely off the rails, either putting unnecessary emphasis on one thing or ignoring something else, or quite frankly, having a correct kernel of truth, but then taking a complete, digression away from that and getting lost in things that are not necessarily productive. Now, God does not change his mind about sin. Last week, we saw that God was judging the justified people. In verse 5, he was talking about Israel. Today, in verse 6, he was talking about the angels that sinned. Next week, in verse 7, he's going to talk about judging sinners, and he's specifically going to use the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. God has not changed his mind about sin. He doesn't care about your station, nor does he care about the time period. Recall Malachi 3:6. It's one of my favorite verses. It says, I am the Lord your God. I change not. We also see in Hebrews that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's a very hopeful verse for people like you and I, but it also means that God doesn't change his mind about sin. For anyone who thinks that there's some difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, I'm sorry, he tells you that there's not. Furthermore, when we do that, we tend to ignore all of the love, mercy, and grace that God shows in the Old Testament. Just read through the book of Isaiah and realize, quite frankly, how much Israel deserved to be completely wiped off the face of the earth, and yet God said, no, I'm not going to do that. Conversely, when people say that the God of the New Testament is somehow different, they're obviously ignoring Revelation, where Jesus comes back and does some really metal things. He does not mess around there. It's the same God. You just shouldn't forget that. Finally, sin must be dealt with and judged. The church, us, again, I'm talking to the real church. I'm talking to Calvary Chapel, Anne Arundel County, and the larger mystical church as a whole. We need to purge the sin and apostasy within us. We need to look at ourselves, take a real hard critical look, ask God to reveal that sin in us, just as David did. He pleaded out to God. He says, search me and know, if there's any wickedness that's in me. David didn't even trust himself to do that. We have to go to God for that. And again, I think the fact that, as we pointed out in the first session, that all of these apostates crept in unnoticed speaks volumes to the state of their church. Because we're going to find out that these apostates, they slipped in, they were complaining, they were practicing sexual immorality, they were teaching all kinds of weird, aberrant doctrines, they didn't respect authority, they hated everyone basically, and nobody noticed any difference between them and everybody else. I think that speaks volumes to the state of that church. In fact, when you read all of the epistles in the New Testament, and you realize that all of those were written to believers, dealing with actual problems that they were having in their real lives, it all of a sudden takes on a whole different meaning and context. All of the problems that the people in the Church of Corinth were dealing with, it wasn't Paul writing to them about, everything else happening outside the church. It was Paul writing to them, telling them what was happening inside their own church. When you look at Colossians, he's not writing to the false teachers, telling them to stop and knock off, their false teaching. No, he's writing to the church to tell them, what is actually true and how to deal with those kind of things. When you realize that those epistles and all the problems and all the issues that they raise and all of these sometimes very scary things that they say are not addressed to the world, they're addressed to the church, it hits a little different. It takes on a different weight and meaning and importance, at least to my mind. Again, one of the interesting realizations that I've had over probably the last 6 to 9 months really has been that fact. I knew that, I understood that, but once I truly started assimilating the fact that these letters were written to the church, not fake church, not people pretending to be the church, not the world, but to the church, it puts their problems and our modern problems in a much different context. So what does this actually mean for us? Who cares? What does this mean for us? Number one, these angels, they stopped fulfilling their purpose. Recall that God made angels for a series of purposes. We listed about 5 of those. They stopped fulfilling that purpose. The job of a steward, and we are stewards, is to be found faithful. If you go to Luke 12, verse 42, Jesus is talking about the faithful servant. He says, and the Lord said, who then is the faithful and wise steward whom his master will make ruler over his household to give him their portion of food in due season? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find doing when he comes. You have to be faithful. That was the key characteristic that God looked for. It wasn't occasionally doing the right thing. He was doing the right thing day in and day out, regardless of what else was happening around you. So God has a purpose for us, and I'll just ask individually, how are we doing with that purpose? Do we know what God's purpose is for us? God has bought you, he's created you, he has purchased you with his own blood. He's put an investment into you, and he wants to see a return on that investment. So what specifically and uniquely has he called and equipped you to deal with? Figure that out and pursue it with your whole life. That's your purpose. When we're not doing that, how far is God going to go to set us right? Again, we talked about this a little bit last week, but God loves you too much to leave you unproductive. He loves you too much to see you stagnate, not mature. In the millennium, when we eventually get there, when we eventually get through the judgment seat of Christ, are we going to have anything to show for our time here? Or are we just going to be kind of, given menial tasks because we showed that God couldn't really trust us with anything? There's a phrase that Paul uses, to be a eunuch for Christ. That's an interesting thought. The eunuch was someone who gave up everything, literally gave up absolutely everything. He didn't even consider his own body his own. And he gave that all up. And because that eunuch gave up everything, the king could trust him with his most valuable possessions. EUNUCH. There we go. I'm very bad at spelling. I trick spell check quite frequently. I'm terrible. I really wish English could be a phonetic language like everybody else, but no. We just have to be this dumb fusion of like German and old Saxon languages. It's a mess anyway. Yeah, eunuch for Christ. You gave up absolutely everything. Now here's a really weird one to think about. And I'm going to sort of take history a little bit out of context here. If you look at China and its history of eunuchs, when did you become a eunuch? Did you become a eunuch when you were selected to be a eunuch and go into the Forbidden City? No. You had to become a eunuch before you went into the Forbidden City, before you were even selected to serve in that role. I think that's absolutely wild. Now, I'm not going to say Paul had in mind, Chinese harem practices. I doubt he did, but I think it's a really interesting example for us and how we're supposed to treat this. We're not supposed to, treat this as something we get someday. I think we're supposed to work for it now in total. All right. One final point before we head out. We often, especially when studying eschatology, talk about the days of Noah and reference the last days. Well, what we were talking about was the days of Noah and some really weird things. I think we need to be prepared. We need to be observant. We need to be vigilant and realize that there's probably going to be some really weird stuff that's going to start happening. The principalities and powers of the air, i.e. these spiritual forces that we have around us, they shape much of the world that we see. I have up there on the screen a really interesting book. It's a book by Dr. Ernst Schleiter, who is a German mystic, occultist, nudist, and all-around weirdo in sort of the 20s and 30s in Germany. He wrote a book called Magic, History, Theory, and Practice. It's a sort of major occultic text. That one specifically, if you want to, you can go down to the Library of Congress right now to the Jefferson Building and check it out. The reason you can go there is because that book was owned by a very famous person. That book was owned by Adolf Hitler. He had a very large and extensive library. In that book, he underlined a very interesting phrase, and he did it in his own hand. He underlined the following phrase, quote, "He who does not carry demonic seeds within him will never give birth to a new world." I think that is really interesting and kind of disturbing. A lot of Christians will look at Hitler and realize he was under some form of demonic influence. I think he very deliberately did that. And I think he understood, at least to a certain extent, what that was. He tried to usher in a new world. And in fact, in many cases, he did, in fact, usher in a new world. Our current world system would not exist if it wasn't for Adolf Hitler. He did usher in a new world, but it just wasn't the one that he wanted. Now we're told in 1 John 4, verse 4, that greater is he that is in you and me than he that is in the world. Greater is he that is in me than he that was in Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler turned the world upside down and ushered in a new world. Why haven't I turned the world upside down and ushered in a new world? There was only one of him. There's millions of us. Why have we not turned the world upside down? Is it because we haven't effectively dealt with the sin in our own lives? Is it because we haven't effectively dealt with what's going on around us? Is it because we don't believe in the power of God? We may give intellectual assent to it, but when push comes to shove, we really kind of become very timid Christians. No, we have the answers, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that because God has given us those answers. Again, Hitler turned the world upside down, and he was just a single guy. We have no excuse for failing to do anything less. Let's pray out. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your time. I thank you for the word that we've gone through today, and that even in these strange and seemingly bizarre passages that you've hidden so much richness there for us that doesn't simply stay as some sort of strange and forgotten relic, but that deeply and intimately applies to our lives, to what we're going through today, to how we're supposed to live. And I pray that through all of our failings and our faults, Lord, that you would help us to see what our purpose is in you, and that we would single-mindedly and obsessively go after that, Lord. That we would purge from ourselves and around us those things that are displeasing to you, and that there would be nothing to get in our way of running the race well, so that we can better please you and better serve you, Lord. And that at the end of all things, we would truly be pleasing in your sight. We know that we will ultimately, but we also know that we want to get there with something to show for it, Lord. I thank you for that, and I pray that you would speak to each one of us individually and show us what you would have us to do for you that would make us more pleasing in your sight, Lord. Amen. Next week,